But look, another story about the media that really has been making headlines. And you may have formed an impression which would be correct about our editorial policy set by me in terms of foreign events. Because we are a New Zealand-owned, New Zealand-operated organisation, we tend to focus on matters within New Zealand, those which I guess we can influence and influence us when they occur to us. But we do, with some regularity, check up on some world events, Ukraine being one of them. And I guess an editorial policy is developed for us that we use Professor Robert Patman. Why? Because by reputation and people I've spoken to who know about him, I didn't just pick this guy's name out of a hat. He's a good lecturer, he's a good communicator, he knows his stuff, and he appears to operate and look at issues overseas in particular without an inherent political bias or without ascribing to a political philosophy or an ideology. So I find Professor Patman, as an expert interview, a guy I can trust. And I think, I'm not saying he's moderate, I'm saying he's factual and he's not extremist in the way he might talk about what is going on. And he's also someone, to be honest, he spends way more time than I do looking at international affairs. As do, for many other news organisations, the international wire agencies. Outfits like AAP, if that's still going, Reuters, maybe even the BBC, we could say. But there are plenty of international networks and organisations which gather news globally and are very good at doing it, and they often sell the results of their labours to news organisations in other countries. And Radio New Zealand has an arrangement with Reuters, which provides coverage of events like Ukraine. But it has now been revealed that over some years, it may be, over the last couple of years in the Ukraine war, 15 reports out of Reuters that have gone through the editorial process and made it onto the digital site or onto the radio on Radio New Zealand have had alterations made to them, which is not in itself unusual as one finesses overseas copy to suit the format of whatever your news organisation is. But substantive changes as to fact made, changes which appear to be pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian and to support or promulgate what some might call Russian propaganda. And Radio New Zealand, gosh, I'll tell you what, the people at Media Watch, and I've never seen this before, actually worked a weekend day. I think they worked Saturday at Media Watch, which I have never seen Colin Peacock get his ass out of bed for any other story, maybe an election over that. So it's a big story. Radio New Zealand have suspended a staff member from, I think, their digital team, and they've called for an independent, or they're launching an independent investigation. So in other words, someone from outside will look at what has happened. And the story's made international headlines. How important is it, and what was it that these altered Reuters reports were saying? Was it in any way true? Well, strangely enough, I've gone back to our expert and asked us to join us this morning to give us some perspective. So Professor Robert Patman joins us again now. How are you, Robert? Thank you. Sorry for...
Good morning, Sean.
I never thought we'd be speaking again so rapidly after our conversation last week.
No worries.
All right. You've obviously been following the story, huh?
Mm.
Is it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, but also quite disturbing. And to be fair, I think RNZ are also quite perturbed about it. And the slippage between the Reuters copy that they received and the fact that it was in at least 15 cases, I think 15 articles have been changed to give what appears to be a pro-Russian slant to a number of stories. And there's always a problem for media organisations, including Reuters, when trying to be fair and be impartial as much as you can between media output from an authoritarian state where independent journalists have been crushed, and a situation where the media output of a liberal democracy like Ukraine, which has a lot more diversity, and trying to be fair between the two. And one of the criticisms we've had actually during the Ukraine war is that many Western media organizations have sometimes equated the media output of Russia with as much weight as the media output of Ukraine. So it's a tricky balance to get. And so that's a big problem in itself. But this is of quite a different scale, where you receive copy and then it's subsequently amended. So my understanding is that RNZ are conducting a pretty energetic investigation. The person concerned has been has taken leave, and so we'll just have to wait the outcome. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously a setback for an impartial news organisation like RNZ, which has a good reputation, I think, nationally and internationally. And yeah, it shows you that with situations like war and peace, particularly a war in Ukraine, such slippages between the copy and the actual output can have major implications and consequences.
Robert, is there the main focus on the story was that in general the origins of the conflict were sort of rewritten to a Russian perspective, and that was that ethnic Russians were being suppressed or persecuted in the Donbass region, and the Ukrainian government was waging war on its own people, and the Russians moved to protect people who happen to live in Ukraine. Is there any validity to that version of events or to that perspective? And also it was very much about whether or not there'd been a coup in Russia or some elections or in Ukraine, or a pro-Russian government had been overthrown in a coup or removed by popular uprising.
I think the term coup does not quite... A coup suggests a top-down movement against a democratic elected government. There was certainly a situation, and I think if we could take our listeners back to just the events of 2013, the then government of Ukraine signed, or was poised to sign, an association trade agreement with the EU. And the Putin government publicly indicated its displeasure with Ukraine signing this agreement, and basically put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government backed away from the agreement, and that led to a public backlash. And that public backlash and the reaction of the government, which resulted in a number of protesters being killed, which then escalated the situation, led to a situation where the then Ukrainian prime minister fled to Russia. And you could say it was a bottom-up or a grassroots revolt or backlash against the then pro-Russian government, which was elected in 2010. So these are sensitive events. But what was clearly wrong in the intervention by the RNZ journalists was the suggestion that a referendum was held and then Russia assumed control of Crimea. Right. It was actually, first of all, Crimea was annexed by Russia, and then a referendum, which was not subject to international monitoring, but to the monitoring of Russian troops, was then conducted to ratify what had already happened, which was the annexation of Crimea. And that didn't come out in the example that's been cited publicly. Right.
Robert, those inconsistencies, and some would use the trendy term, that disinformation, is it widespread amongst any particular groups, or is it disinformation that one could say or draw a line, say that's coming out of the Kremlin or coming out of Russian bots and stuff, or is it just something that's out there and about on the interweb amongst people who are into conspiracy theories and, 9/11 was a set-up job, etc., etc.? Are those radical or specific mistruths?
I think, Sean, with the rise of the social media in the last 15 years, it has changed. You know this better than I will. It's changed the media scene dramatically. And it means that authoritarian states, China and Russia, are very concerned to influence some of the debates which are occurring in countries where there is a free press, where there's freedom of expression. They don't allow it at home, but they certainly want to influence what's happening overseas. And in a sense, they are insecure because they are worried about their own people. Authoritarian regimes like Russia and China spend a lot of their time and their efforts securing themselves against their own people. And they're very worried about ideas seeping into the system which challenge the legitimacy of their monopoly of power. So they do engage in disinformation. They try to cause discord, and this is well documented, and it is a problem. I mean, of course, Russia and China are entitled to their own point of view, but it's often, it'd be naive to believe that these authoritarian states don't try to influence debates which are occurring in Western society.
I'd hate to prejudge the outcome of any so-called independent inquiry that Radio New Zealand would conduct, but it would seem to me we've got to, in the year 2023, and for the very reasons you just mentioned, you see, part of me, the initial reaction would be, some journalist is being paid by the Russians to spread this disinformation, etc., etc. But it might just be that there's someone inside an organisation that spends a little bit too much time online and is a little bit too invested in their social media account and has decided or made poor editorial judgments. I don't think that's true because I've been spending too much time on the interweb. It is, and this is, I guess, why this story is interesting, exactly how this came to pass, maybe a reflection. And the interesting thing to me is this isn't, it's not what the Disinformation Project and those who would set up new restrictions on our freedom of speech have said the problem is. It's not local Nazis getting together and going against minority groups in New Zealand. It's actually the sort of global stage. And I don't know, I look at it and say, would that misreporting make much difference to what happens in Ukraine? And the answer is probably no.
That may or may not be the case, but you see many people are busy and they have not got time to compare RNZ's coverage of what's happening in Ukraine with that of the platform or other media outlets. Yeah. And therefore, they may believe, I think with some justification, RNZ's been pretty reliable on most things, that RNZ's coverage of the Ukraine, in particular, its coverage of the origins of the crisis, are pretty fair and balanced. And so there is a danger, I think, that changes of tweaking the language can sometimes throw a particular framing of an event. And so that can have an impact on debates within a country. And I think, all reputable media organisations want to be as accurate as possible. Yeah. And it is a tricky situation where as I tried to explain before, Russia does not tolerate independent journalists. It doesn't tolerate people being critical of Mr. Putin on a systemic basis. Yeah. We are seeing dissent breaking out within people who previously were sympathetic to Mr. Putin, but that's something different.
And words do matter. That's what journalism is all about. Words do matter, and we try and get to the truth, even though it's an imperfect art or trade. I guess the other thing, too, is I have looked online and spent a little bit of time this weekend looking at what sort of people and what sort of groups online have been backing I would call it, my perception would be the alternate reality as regards the war in Ukraine, and that is that the Ukrainians, let's just put it bluntly, the Ukrainians are all Nazis and the Russians are wonderful people. I don't know, defending freedom, standing up for what's right, and they've got every right to be bombing the hell out of people and invading Ukraine. And I looked at the sort of people who seem to be adhering to that or promoting that theory, and they're the same sort of people, it would seem to me, who are madly anti-vaccination. And as I said, think 9/11 was a put-up job. There seems to be a group of characteristics around the people I see on social media who promote this narrative.
Yeah, that may well be true. It seems to me the Ukraine coverage is a bit of a minefield for analysts and academics because if you take a certain view, as I have, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was illegal, then you're quickly cast as someone who is pro-Nazi, pro-Ukrainian in the eyes of some, which is, of course, ludicrous. I mean, the crucial dividing line is that you either have international rules or you don't. And it's quite clear in the case of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine who's broken the rules, and it's Russia.
Yeah.
And that's quite important to observe. But I don't think this stuff should be taken lightly, and I think it's very important that RNZ is seen and to do so quickly to deal with this matter in an appropriate fashion. But it's as I say, it's a challenging job managing the news coverage of a conflict. It's not like a battle between two.
Can I just say, I'm happy to do their independent review for them. Will this make news around the world, do you think?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I don't know how, I haven't done enough background research on this to comment authoritatively, but my sense is that Reuters may have raised this issue with RNZ.
Yeah.
I'm not sure RNZ spotted it in-house or whether it was Reuters who raised it first. I'm not quite sure, but if it was Reuters, then that has implications for the relationship between RNZ and Reuters, which is a pretty authoritative.
And look,
news.
my banter with Radio New Zealand, as I call them, Red Radio, I was only joking. But there is no question, let's make it clear, and I want to reiterate, that somehow the Kremlin, there's no suggestion here that the Kremlin somehow, or the KGB or whatever their FSB as they're now called, directly is influencing, the boss of or the board of Radio New Zealand. I mean, that is ludicrous, is it not?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
good.
it is.
Let's make that clear.
But it may be a disinformation campaign by the Kremlin that may have had some traction with someone working with RNZ and who was motivated perhaps by what they consider to be honourable motives to adjust Reuters' copy in a way which, my understanding is, Reuters make the copy available to many news organisations on the assumption that the copy will be respected.
Yes, but they do allow what I think they call finessing of copy. That's you've got a story that's 4 minutes long and you've only got 2 minutes or 30 seconds to tell it.
Sure.
And a lot of people used to be, and I've done it myself for a job, you would be involved in taking a story and condensing it. And it was a work of journalism, of processing, actually, of sub-editing. So we will see. In the meantime, I guess Radio New Zealand has to try and protect its reputation. And if people really do want a good and reasoned and balanced take on what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world, Robert, they can always go online on the platform and listen to my interviews with you. I had to get the plug.
Thank you, Sean.
Hey, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Important story, and thank you for your perspectives on it, which do not come from the Kremlin.
Thank you.
Cheers. That is Professor Robert Patman. Interesting, eh? Interesting. So I think it's some man or woman or boy or girl working at Radio New Zealand who spends too much time on the interweb. And I think we've got to know what has gone on here. But I do seem to think the Venn diagram, people who think the Ukraine is, the Russians are right in Ukraine, people with vaccine, anti-vaxxers, one big circle.